Hello, everyone. Let's get started here this evening. I want to welcome you all here tonight. Glad you could join us on such a lovely evening, huh? Oh, yeah. Let's see, on with our speaker. I just wanted to mention that on November 30th, we're having a Christmas open house at our building, 115 Ashman. And we're going to be, Dennis Hank is going to help us out. And we plan on having an operating O-gauge Sioux Line Christmas train display. Or on display, I should say. I wasn't sure if I'd remember the O-gauge part, so that's why I'm reading it. But, and Richard Troutline is also going to be having some toys and on display also. So we're going to make a sort of a Christmas festival out of it. And then we also have the place usually decorated for Christmas. So come and join us for that, and maybe you'll find some Christmas present ideas too. You never know, because our gift shop will be open also. So anyway, thanks again, and let's have Susan, she has a couple announcements, and then she'll introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to use this. Might help, I don't know. And that was Mary June, if you didn't know, president of the Chippewa County Historical Society. I'm Susan James, the vice president for programs and publications, and also the assistant director here at Bayless Library, a member of Superior District Library. We welcome back Dan Truckee, who has spoken here in recent years about his exhibits on storytelling and UP sports history. He's director of the Beaumier UP Heritage Center at Northern Michigan University with over 20 years of experience working in the museum and history field. After graduating from NMU with a BA in history, he earned an MA in popular culture from Bowling Green State University and an MA in history museum studies at Cooperstown graduate program. Tonight he'll talk about Lost and Found, historic structures of the UP, the topic of his recent exhibit. Related to that exhibit is the display case in the back of the room, and thank you to board member Paul Sabrin and Carolyn Person for setting up the display. It's the contents of the time capsule from the Chippewa County Courthouse, and that was recently on view in Marquette. So please welcome Dan Truckee.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks for having me back. I always love coming to the Sioux. As many of you know, I have family here. None of them are here tonight. Got other stuff going on. They've been to the other talks of mine, so they're like, "Oh, we've seen him talk before." But it's always a pleasure to come to the Sioux. And I was just, when I come here, I love looking at all the photos. And I was looking at, you know, idea how old this photo is, Jim? Of the bridge.
Oh. That's a good question for us. Ancient Sioux person.
Any ancient Sioux people there?
That's not old. Probably 50 years ago. Yeah, that's
No, the
not old.
bridge has only been open 50 years.
Okay, I was just wondering how old that was.
That's not old enough for me. No, that's 60s, early 60s, isn't it? 50s.
It's just interesting for me because right behind it is the old railroad bridge. And whenever I see that, whenever I'm here in town and I see the old railroad bridge, it reminds me of 1910. My grandmother crossed that bridge at the age of 5.
Wow.
And came to the United States with her family from Canada. And went straight to Munising, where their dad was already living.
63.
And that's where she grew up, in Munising. So she crossed that bridge on the train. That's how people came here from Ontario back then. And I have the actual record, I found it on Ancestry.com, of her crossing the border. With her whole family listed, and that was an incredible find. And it's one of the reasons I do what I do, because I love that kind of stuff. I love history, I love family history. A lot of events and programs that I've done, I've been able to bring in family history, my own, and deal with family history. So this is all very close to my heart. She was a Ganya, and I know many of you probably know Ganyas from Canada. She was one of those Ganyas, and quite recently online I realized that through the Ganya family I am related to Hillary Clinton, Celine Dion, Madonna, the actor Ryan Gosling, and my favorite, Jack Kerouac, the writer. So when I found that out, I was a happy camper. So that explains a lot of my lost youth, is my family connection to Jack Kerouac.
How about Shania Twain?
I don't know if I'm related. She looks a lot like some of my family members, so it's very possible. We all look alike, those Canadians, you know. So anyway, just a little side note there. But it's always great coming here and seeing old friends and talking about this stuff. Before I started, I put this up, and the discussion already was, when was this? People were asking. I didn't know, and then Jim Dwyer said, that's a postcard from 1902 to 1906. So we know that it's from that period. Not sure. I knew it had to be earlier in 1910 because you don't see any cars, and you would have seen automobiles by 1910 in downtown Marquette. But we do know that. And there's actually one business on this street that's still running today. Do any of you know what that is?
Salvation Army of Burlington.
Well, not Salvation Army, yes, but not in that street. The Veerling restaurant, you'll see right at the corner, you'll see the VIE.
Yeah, Burley is.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is the oldest restaurant in Marquette. It's not the oldest bar in Marquette. The oldest bar in Marquette is the Wooden Nickel, which still claims to be the original, one of the last of the originals. And the Wooden Nickel is in North Marquette on Presque Isle Avenue. Which now you can go to, but when I was a student, unless you wore leather and drove a Harley, you'd never even dare stepping into the Wooden Nickel, truthfully. And now you can, because it's open. Now students go there. It's kind of funny. So that is the only business that's still here. A lot of these buildings are gone now, unfortunately, and some of them are still standing. The ones on the right are all standing. The left block, no. This is post the big fire in 1868, so it's really urban renewal is the reason why a lot of those buildings are now gone on the left. My talk tonight, though, is about this whole concept. And really that, in a way, is kind of a great example. The right, we've saved. The left is all gone. And that is what's happened in communities around the United States with historic structures. Every town in the United States is guilty of tearing down its historic past. No one is innocent in this respect. And Marquette is no different than anywhere else. It's done a better job than some in saving its historic structures, but it's also done its share of tearing buildings down, and some of them came down by their own accord. They had nothing to do with urban renewal, they were just fires. Like I said, in 1868, Marquette had a huge fire that destroyed like 4 blocks of the downtown, which led to Marquette having a new ordinance that all buildings had to have a brick facade so that fires wouldn't spread like that. And of course, tonight I'm driving down through the Sioux and going, oh yeah, well, they tore that down and they tore that down. So the Sioux has done the same thing, but communities all over the United States have done that. And fortunately, and that's what I wanted to talk about today, is how that's changed. That whole perception in America has changed for the better, and we're trying to correct that. So this talk is going to be about historic preservation as well as about the structures in the UP. How this program came about is that Jack Dale and Jim Caspian in Marquette were doing a program on lost buildings in Marquette. And it's a fantastic program just showing the buildings that have been lost. And it's sad when you think about it. Marquette's lost some incredible structures over the years. And I thought, well, we should take that and do an exhibit about the entire Upper Peninsula. So that's what we did. We didn't get as many buildings as we would have liked, but we found it was, because we involved a lot of historical societies around the UP in getting nominations for buildings, and your historical society nominated several buildings to be included. And some historical societies never participated at all, so we didn't get as much participation as we did from you and from some others. So we didn't get as many as we'd like, but we found, I think, some really great stories, and that's what this is all about. Buildings are more than just structures, they're stories, and the lives that people had in those buildings. The purpose of the exhibit, was to feature structures that have been lost over the years, either from fire, neglect, or urban renewal. To feature structures that still stand but are in critical need of restoration or are near destruction. And to feature buildings that have been successfully restored or renovated to be used either for their original function or something entirely different. And so in my program, I'm going to talk about all three of these. I'm going to show you examples of some from around the UP. The real question is, why do we save historic structures? I was meeting with the Rotary this week, giving this presentation in Marquette. And it was good because a lot of them are business people in the community, and I wanted them to kind of understand why we save historic structures. It saves the historical integrity of a community, creating a meaningful link to a community's past. In other words, it creates a sense of place. And that's a very important thing in the United States today. More and more, people want a sense of place. And you see this, a lot of people talk about why Michigan has lost a lot of its population. And they wonder about that, and they say, well, it's just jobs, And I'm like, well, I don't know. Have you ever spent any time in Livonia or Southfield? They're okay places, but they're pretty generic. And a lot of the United States is that suburban generic America. And more Americans are turning away from that. They want something more real. They want something regional. They want character, a sense of place. And you see this across the nation. You see it on television. You see shows on the Food Network or on the Travel Channel. You see Andrew Zimmern going to all these towns, not eating at Chi-Chi's or Red Lobster. He's eating the local, the regional food. That's why his shows are so popular, because people have a newfound appreciation for this. And so that's one of the reasons why we save historic structures. And that also connects with number 2, which it contributes to the quality of life by providing a more attractive and culturally vibrant life in the community. There's no doubt that having historic structures contributes to a greater cultural life in your community. And creates a quality of life which is attractive to people. Not only to people who live there, but people who might want to live there. Businesses that want to relocate there. That's one of the reasons Michigan has struggled getting businesses. It's not just taxes. It's also places to live. They don't want to open businesses in places nobody wants to live. And so, but places like Traverse City, Marquette, are attracting people. Why? They have vibrant downtowns, historic preservation, they have a sense of place, and that's where people want to relocate. So the communities that have saved that, those are the ones that are attracting people and businesses, okay? And that ties with number 3. It's good for business. Business people don't think about this. They think historic preservation is, oh, something nice, you just do that because it's nice for the community. No, it's good for business. Americans in growing numbers, like I said, are leaving suburban communities and moving to rural or urban environments, okay? Because they're becoming tired of homogenization of culture. But communities that have saved historic districts are much more prosperous than those that have not, across the board. This is especially true in downtown districts that have been preserved and restored. And there are examples of this throughout the United States, and I've seen it myself in the many places I've lived and traveled around the United States. Those that have restored historic districts and have historic districts are more prosperous. All for all these other reasons that I mentioned. A good example is a community like Omaha, Nebraska. A good portion of Omaha, Nebraska is suburban. But at one time, this old warehouse district down along the river that nobody wanted to go into, they decided to restore several blocks of this as the warehouse district. And now it is the center of cultural life in Omaha. Okay, and it has made Omaha a destination for people all over that region. That's where people go. And they don't go just to shop in the malls, they go to eat and shop in the antique stores and the boutiques and all the places down in this historic district. And it's really been an attraction and a great thing for Omaha to save that district. It's revitalized Omaha as a cultural place. And Omaha is, now in that region, is considered the Ann Arbor, if you will, of Nebraska, Iowa, that whole area to some extent. Not far away from there is a community that I lived in for several years, and that's Sioux City, Iowa. Sioux City, Iowa is about an hour and a half north of Omaha. It's always had kind of a contentious relationship with Omaha. In fact, at one time they battled for the railroad. You know, who was going to be the next Chicago? Was it going to be Omaha or Sioux City? Omaha won. They got the railroad, and Sioux City never did grow as big as its ambitions. At one time, Sioux City, though, was a really significant city in the sense that it had a wonderful downtown district, boulevards like this with beautiful Romanesque, Richardsonian Romanesque buildings and opera houses and everything. And this was its main street, 4th Street. But like a lot of cities in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, they decided that it would be best to tear down most of that. And they did. In the process, they built these large hotels and glass office buildings and banks, and they put a J.C. Penney's downtown. They wanted to create more of a suburban atmosphere, pedestrian walkways and plazas and skywalks, which is kind of funny they have skywalks. It's never that cold there to have a skywalk. It's not like Sault Ste. Marie. But, you know, that's what they decided to do with this 4th Street. And probably the greatest insult is that in one area where they had torn down all these buildings, they built a new convention center and they put it right in the middle of the street. So they destroyed the whole idea of it being the main street of town. And that was the urban planning of the 1970s and 80s, this idea of creating pedestrian malls versus downtown districts and large main streets and boulevards. What happened was where Omaha prospered because they had saved this historic district, Sioux City's downtown is basically dead. Nobody goes there, or rarely goes there at night, we're going there at night to take part of any kind of cultural life. It was kind of become just this place during the day that people did business, and that was it. It wasn't a place that people visited or wanted to necessarily visit from around the area. And by the 1990s, the community had come to realize this, that they had made a big mistake. Now, there was one part of 4th Street that they didn't destroy. It was at the east end of the street, right by the stockyards. And there was a reason they didn't take it down. That was the red light district of town. And they built a convention center between it and the downtown to kind of separate it from the downtown, because they wanted to clean it up. Because Sioux City is kind of a rough and tumble town. So this was, for many, many years, the sin part of Sioux City. Now, it is the historic district of Sioux City. They restored all of these buildings, these beautiful buildings, which at one time were decrepit or were literally houses of ill repute. And it is now the main attraction in town. When people come to the city, this is where they go. This is where they go to eat. There's a brew pub, there's coffee houses, there's music, there's block parties. I mean, this is where people go in the community now. So it just shows you 2 different examples of what communities have done and what historic preservation did for those communities. This has been a major difference for Sioux City. But at the same time, Omaha did it on a much bigger level, and it's, again, Sioux City second, Omaha first. Don't tell people in Sioux City I said that. They had kind of a chip on their shoulder. But across America, you see this. You see communities have done this, it's been a major difference. And this is why we do historic preservation. It isn't just because it's good for us, like orange juice for breakfast. It is because it creates vibrant communities. It creates a connection with our past. And that's more important than people really give credence to. And I'll talk about that through this program. Now I want to first start with the bad stories. That's the lost structures. And then we'll move on to the success stories. How many of you remember the Alger County Courthouse? None of you do.
I don't remember it, but I have photos of it.
I didn't know you guys were that young. I remember the Alger County Courthouse. It was this is it. This was what it looked like. Now, this is a postcard. It's probably a little idealized. But the nice thing about it is it actually stood at the end of Elm Street and down. If you were in downtown Munising at the corner of Elm and Superior Street, you looked up Elm, you would see it at the top of the hill. It's this majestic, beautiful building at the top of the hill. And my grandfather worked there as a janitor for many years, and this was the pride and joy of Munising, their courthouse. Unfortunately, in 1978, it caught on fire, burned to the ground. What happened was there were some oily rags in the janitor's closet. It wasn't my grandfather. He was retired by then. There were some oily rags in the janitor's closet that combusted and set the place on fire. And so it was destroyed. There's really not much you could have done about that, and it was a sad thing. But really, in the end, what was sad about it, besides losing this and all the records that were in it, because they lost all the community's records that were being housed there, is what they replaced it with, which is this. You know? So when you look up Elm Street now from downtown Munising, you don't see this beautiful dome structure. You see a brick box. Change the very look of the community. Okay? And the thing is that this is what communities all over did, not just Munising, but everywhere. Go to Marquette. We built a new city hall in Marquette. I was talking to the former mayor. He says, yeah, we hated that building, so we wish we could move back into the old city hall, which is now a lawyer's offices. They couldn't afford it. The city wouldn't be able to buy it now if they wanted to, because this is basically what they built in Marquette for city hall. But this, in the time frame, 1980, this is the kind of building you built. You didn't think about aesthetics. You thought about, well, we need this amount of square footage, and that's the kind of building we're going to build. And this is what you came up with. So part of our problem isn't just that we lost buildings, it's what we replaced them with. And unfortunately, a lot of them were torn down in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, which people are now looking at as the nadir in American architectural history. This is not our high point, folks, okay? This was our lowest time in architecture. We're finally getting back to building buildings that are attractive and beautiful and have some type of, symbolism and meaning. But this was a time when most of the buildings they built, especially in poor towns like Munising, looked like this. They couldn't afford to build that kind of building anymore. Other buildings we feature in the exhibit are things that a lot of people don't even think about as being significant structures. That's because I think buildings it isn't just courthouses and churches that we connect to. Sometimes it's the vernacular architecture of our community. Vernacular being something that is totally not part of any type of architectural tradition, created usually by someone in a community based on their own whim. And that would be the milk bottle building at the Asland's Dairy, which this was located in Norway. Does anyone remember this building? Yeah, there's a couple of you do. Anybody ever drove along US 2 back in the day remembers this building because you passed by it. And for many people, this was this building was, for my wife, whose father was from that area, it was very, that's her memories of going to visit her grandparents as a kid, was seeing the milk bottle building and going and touring it. And so when it was torn down in the early 80s, people felt that they really lost something. They lost a connection to their community, their childhood, because a lot of schools visited the dairy. It was always something that the schools visited. And for people who drove along US 2, that was it was halfway point between here and Minneapolis or something, So it's one of those markers that we had in our community. Now, there may have been major issues with it, why it had to be torn down, I'm not exactly sure. But this was a building that was lost, and a lot of memories and stories were lost with it. Talk about stories and memories. Probably none of them, and no building represents that more than this one, the Italian Hall in Calumet, which now we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the tragedy that occurred in this building in 1913, when over 70 children and adults were killed and crushed in an accident in a false fire alarm. There's an incredible movie about it that came out past year, 1913 Massacre, which is a contentious term to say the least, because a lot of people disagree with that term. But I know it's going to be airing in Marquette soon, and I think it'd be something to bring here to show at the library at some time, because it's a really powerful film, not only about the event, but public memory and how people remember it. Because this was 100 years ago when that occurred, and to this day, people in Calumet still argue about it. There are still people divided in the community by that event, because it was so connected with the strike that was occurring at that time, and the lives of people, and where they were in that community. Were they miners? Were they foremen? Where did their families stand on this line? And so to this day, it still has hard feelings, which is why this building is gone. And in that film, they asked one of the city planners in Calumet today, why did they tear this building down in 1984? And he said, ghosts. And that's all he said. Because figuratively or literally, ghosts, the ghosts of that building and what happened in that day have haunted Calumet ever since. And for some people, it's something that they just wanted to forget about. They wanted Calumet to move. They all thought the only reason anyone knew anything about Calumet, Michigan, was because of that awful tragedy that occurred there in 1913. And there are others who felt like, this was an awful tragedy, but there's a bigger story behind it that we can tell. And they have. And now the National Historic Parks is there, all the historical organizations in there have become extremely involved in preservation efforts. And now Calumet is a very different community than it was 20 years ago. How many of you have been to Calumet in the last 10, 15 years? I mean, it's totally revitalized community. Not just because of the Park Service, but because the community and the whole county have said, you know what, the mines probably aren't coming back. And literally, I grew up in the Western UP, and believe me, there are people there still today going, they're coming back, someday they're gonna mine again. And they just might, you never know. But the truth is that probably they're never gonna mine anywhere near what they mined in the past. Even though it's still there, it's probably not gonna happen. And people had to realize we have to find a new life. What do we have? Our history. Look at our incredible town. Look at all these buildings. We were a town of over 30,000 people at one time. Look at the structures we have. Look at the history that's here that we have to tell people about. And they embrace that, and now there are people who come all over the United States to that area to see that stuff. History, tourism, historic preservation have changed Keweenaw, Houghton County completely. And that's a great thing. That's a great sign for why we do this work. And unfortunately, we can't undo this. This is what happened to the Italian home. But it was a great lesson. In fact, many said that, and in the movie they talk about this, that this was the thing that got Calumet to think about saving its history. That it was a catalyst for everything that happened afterwards. So in a way, it was a good thing that they tore it down. This is all that's left of the Italian home today, is the archway of the doorway, which is now a memorial in the middle of the town. Now, here in Sault Ste. Marie, of course, you have plenty of examples of buildings that you tore down, I'm sure. And when we were selecting buildings, your historical society proposed several, and they were all very worthy. But we were looking also for different kinds of buildings, not just significant, important buildings, but those that were very involved in the community's life. And we were really intrigued with the Radel drugstore in Sault Ste. Marie. And you guys had great photographs of it, both interior and exterior. And also just the drugstore, but also there was the photo studio upstairs. It was there for a long time. So this was a structure that was a really important part of the community for a long time. A lot of people remember this. It was, the drugstore of days gone by is something of the corner drugstore, I should say, is something you don't see much anymore. And so to me, it was kind of a sign of how things have changed. But also, as you know, where this was is now, I believe, an empty lot.
It's a park.
It's a park. Yes, that's right. It's a park. I shouldn't say it's an empty lot, but it's a park. A lot of communities were trying to find park areas in the community, in their downtown areas. That was very common in a lot of urban renewal periods. I'm sure that it probably was in tough shape. I don't know. Probably needed a lot of work. And I know that Sault Ste. Marie has had times where the downtown was in really tough shape. So, why they tore it down exactly, you don't know. But it's an example of something that's got lost from a time gone by. And when downtowns were much more vibrant than they are today. Oh, that's the interior shot of the drugstore. And if I'm not mistaken, these things, a lot of the stuff went to the Public Museum of Grand Rapids to be on display in their village of Grand Rapids in the basement, which I haven't been there in a while, so I don't know if it's still on display. Does anybody know?
It is.
It is?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Now, for us at Northern Michigan University, one of the key things we focused on in the exhibit, or one of the key buildings featured in the exhibit, was K Hall. How many of you remember K Hall in Marquette? So a few of you do. You guys are really fortunate. I know that Lake State is, grown a lot over the years, but Lake State has saved a lot of its old buildings. And that's an important part. It's really created a sense of a campus, a college campus feel. Northern does not have that. And the reason why is it once did, but we tore it all down. And the most significant of all of them was this building complex, which was located right on Presque Isle Avenue. These are the first buildings of Northern. On the far left was Longyear Hall, the first building built on campus in 1900. On the right was the Peter White Science Building, which was built next. There was then a small low structure was built between the two, and then eventually by 1910 they built the big hall in the middle called K Hall. And far to the left is Pierce School. It was actually a K through 12 school where a lot of the student teachers at Northern did their student teaching. And I meet people all the time who went there kindergarten through high school in Pierce High School or Pierce School. This building was really Northern Michigan University for about the first 60 years of its existence until they started to build buildings around the area and extended the campus further to the northwest. By the early 70s, Northern had built several classroom facilities and even a new theater. And they didn't need this building to be a classroom building anymore. They didn't need the theater anymore because we had a brand new theater. It needed a lot of work. It was not up to fire code. There was a lot of concerns about it from a fire standpoint. And the university had to make a decision. Do we save the building or do we tear it down? The state of Michigan made it simple for them. They said, we're not giving you money to restore an old building. We don't give money to restore buildings and university campuses. We'll give you money to build a new one, but not to save it. So the Board of Trustees made a decision to tear it down. I should also add that this was designed by D.F. Charlton, who is the Upper Peninsula's most significant architect in its history. The Marquette Courthouse was designed by Charlton. There's buildings all over the Upper Peninsula. They were designed by him. It was a beautiful Jacobsville brownstone building. The brownstone that this was made of is now priceless. They'll pay top dollar for this today because you can't get it. The decision to tear it down, though, was very controversial. The alumni were up in arms about it. This was the memory for people of Northern. And people in the community didn't want to see it torn down. In the end, the state won out and tore the building down. And they built in its place the building we're located now, which is the CODIS building, which is a really ugly 1970s office building. The truth is that right now we're dealing with the same thing at Northern. Jamrich Hall, which was one of the classroom buildings, it was built to replace this building, we're building a new classroom building with state money, and as part of that we have to tear Jamrich Hall down. Some would say that Jamrich Hall is nothing like K Hall. It's kind of a bland 1970s office classroom building. But at that time, we don't know how people 50 years from now are going to look at buildings. So we have to think about now too. As historians, we don't just think about the past, we think about in saving today, what are people 50 years from now going to care about? We tear down all the buildings that were built in the 70s because we think they're ugly. 50 years from now, they might be going, damn, I love that 70s architecture. Where do you see that stuff? And you're like, ugh. But you know what? People in the 1950s and 60s had the same reaction to Victorian architecture. They saw it as stodgy and old-fashioned, and that's ladies in bustles and almost like bound feet. And so to them, that wasn't progress. That wasn't the future. That was the old crusty past. Get rid of it. Let's build a beautiful glass building. So every time we have to think about this, our perceptions or why things like this happen. This was a great thing to feature in the exhibit because we had lots of students come through and every one of them says the same thing. Why in the hell did you tear that building down? Because today, it would never happen. If that building were on Northern's campus today, we would never tear it. For two reasons. One, things have changed in America. Our attitudes about historic preservation of buildings like this is much greater. We have a higher awareness of the importance of it. And the importance is that it creates a connection with the past and tradition and a sense of place. And students at Northern miss that, because all of our buildings post 1950. And to them, Northern is kind of a bland campus. It doesn't have history, doesn't have tradition. And I was talking about this at the Rotary. Northern, in fact, is starving for traditions at a university. A lot of other universities have tons of traditions. Northern doesn't have many. There's a lot of reasons for that, but Northern's biggest tradition is called the Brulee Run. It is when one of the houses in one of the dormitories, the Brulee House in Gant Hall, whenever the first snow sticks on the ground, the guys in that house get drunk and streak through the quad. And you know what? The university does nothing to stop it. In fact, public safety goes there just to make sure things don't get out of hand. Why? Because Northern is desperate for traditions, for students to have traditions to keep them their memory going. And so when they're alumni and they're going, oh, remember that? Yeah, let's give another $500 to Northern. So that's why it's important. That's why we save these buildings and why universities have done this for eons and eons. I have one more story about this. I know I'm going on and on, but a friend and I both went to college. I went to Northern, and he went to a modern college in South Carolina. And when we were in grad school, we decided to drive to Massachusetts for a weekend. And we drove to Massachusetts, and we drove into Williams, Massachusetts. Some of you ever been to Williams, Massachusetts? One person. It's this absolutely the epitome of a beautiful New England village in the Berkshire Mountains. It's absurdly gorgeous. And the campus, Williams College, is there, and it's these old ivy-covered buildings. And we drove around this campus, and we both looked at each other and said, boy, did we get screwed. and because we didn't have that kind of stuff, those kind of memories and things. There are a lot of threatened structures around the UP. There's probably many here in Chippewa County. There's some of the ones that we featured in the exhibit. One is this wonderful lighthouse building in Ontonagon. It's actually on private property, so there's not much that anyone can do about it except the private landowner. But the belief is that it could be easily restored to be used again with enough funds, but that's just the problem and the will to do it. And so we're not sure where another 50 years from now whether this structure will still be standing. Others are a little more innocuous. This is the Duke of Abruzzi Hall in Caspian, which was the Italian society in Caspian. Caspian is, at one time, was a thriving community, mining community, especially for the Italians. And there still is a very sizable Italian population in Caspian. But this society largely is falling away. Most of the membership, I'm not even sure if they're a functioning society anymore. And there's been a lot of concern over what's going to happen to this building if the society finally ceases, or what will it be used for? Will it be saved? But it doesn't look like much, but this building is an important part of that culture and the history of the community. So even the less significant buildings, physically, have great stories and they're important to our community. Schools. There are schools across the UP that are threatened. Fortunately, many communities have found other uses for their schools, everything from apartments to offices to historical societies. The Ontonagon Elementary School is a building right now. It's empty. It was actually a really fantastic building, very Art Deco, designs, craft work, all through the carved wood all over the school. It's amazing to look at. But the community, Ontonagon is such a struggling community right now that no one's really sure what the future of this building will be. Another 10, 20 years, what's going to happen? It'll fall into disrepair and won't be able to be fixed. That happened in the community. I grew up in Wakefield, had a wonderful memorial building that it eventually just had to tear down because the community just couldn't support it and couldn't fix it up. But there are success stories across the UP as well. How many of you, I know some of you know where this is, Jim. And this is the Lewis County Historical Society in Newberry, which was the sheriff's residence and jail in Newberry. The courthouse, which was next to it, is no longer standing. They only got to save one of the buildings, but at least they got to save this one. And is an incredible example of what you can do in restoring these buildings. Menominee has done an amazing job with restoring downtown buildings. I have pictures of this building. You wouldn't believe what it looked like for a long time. It was just ugly as all hell. They did a great job in fixing up and doing that with several buildings in downtown Menominee. And in the process, they're seeing a greater, it's attracting people into their downtown. They're very proud of this now. But even smaller structures in Michigami, a very tiny town in western Marquette County, there was the Dampierre House, which was one of the early French settlers of the area. This was an old cottage, or a cabin, if you will, home, and they not only did they restore it, they moved it to the site of where their historical society is, and totally restored it. It's now being interpreted, and people are visiting it. So it was saved by the museum. A lot of historic preservation people would say you shouldn't move old buildings, preserve it where it is, but if it was probably going to be tore down where it was, and so at least they saved it in some way in the community. And of course, here in the Sioux, the community moved several historic buildings to Water Street, which weren't there originally, which probably saved those buildings. And also, it's created a place where people can go visit, which is, I think, a good thing. Of course, courthouses are an important part of communities across the UP. Those that didn't burn down, many of them now have been restored. And because they tend to be the pride and joy of communities, courthouses. They were the building that counties and communities really put a lot of resources into building, and they're very proud of that. And this is just one, the Dickinson County Courthouse, which has been restored in Iron Mountain, still used. And of course, churches, like the Immaculate Conception Church in Iron Mountain. This was an Italian parish, it still is. And still a very vibrant ethnic church. A lot of the ethnic churches in the UP have closed over time. My family's French church in Marquette is now gone. That was taken down. But this was one that survived in Iron Mountain. And, we talked about Calumet already. This is the Calumet Theater, which at one time was very close to being destroyed and taken down. Needed a lot of repair, and they've been restoring it now on and off for many, many years. Now it's a functioning theater again, and has been an incredible attraction to the community, brings people to the community from all over for performances, which has helped their restaurant business, their hotels have all been boosted by the Calumet Theater and its revitalization. And of course, how could it leave out the Chippewa County Courthouse, which you folks did a wonderful job of restoring in the 1990s, and is an incredible, wonderful building. I think this is the oldest one in the UP, isn't it?
Oldest in the state.
The oldest in the state, yeah. Or one of the oldest in the state. We won't argue about that. It's the oldest in the UP. That's all that matters, right? Yeah, that's all that matters. But, it was important in restoring this building. You have something of pride in your community, but it also creates a connection to the past. It reminds people in your community and people who come here of what Sault Ste. Marie has been, what it was in its past, what it is today. But I think it's also important with young people, because a lot of young people don't appreciate what's important about their communities. I certainly didn't appreciate these things growing up as a kid in the UP. And it wasn't until I left and I came back and said, wow, this is great. And I wanted to come back to the UP and live here. And that's another reason, is to create a connection that people want to stay, that they don't necessarily want to go away. And I had to live out east because I was like, I'm a historian, I got to go where the old stuff is. And then I got sick and tired of people telling me, oh, there's no history in Michigan. And I said, yes, there is. Sault Ste. Marie is older than Hartford, Connecticut. Did you know that? Not by much, but it actually is. And another building here in Chippewa County, Lipstick Hardware, which the Pickford Area Historical Society has done an amazing job in restoring and building is their new historical society. There are very few communities like Pickford who have done something like this. Most communities the size of Pickford can't afford to restore a building like this. There were people there that just said, we don't want this building to go down. It had such an important history in our community as a store, we want to save it. And they said, okay, and they did. And they've received awards for it. They've been from the Michigan Historic Preservation Network and the Michigan Historical Society and other groups for their work. And now it's their pride and joy in Pickford. You're able to save this structure that normally probably would have fallen down, just as they have in communities all over the UP. My wife's from Rudyard, and I remember for many years visiting Rudyard, and I loved the old grain silo that was along the railroad tracks in downtown Rudyard. But it was right there, right behind Joe's Bar. I always walked over there, and then I drove back into town several years ago after being gone many years, and it was gone. And I was devastated. But how could you keep it standing? What was the use for it? And this is what we have to get into with historic preservation. We can't save every building. As much as we'd like to, we can't do it. You have to have there has to be a purpose for these buildings to be saved. What can we use them for? In this case, it's their historical society, which is a great use, but you can't use every building in the historical society. And they've been used for all sorts of things. Escanaba recently, they restored some buildings on their main street that is a triple. It's businesses and offices and residential all in the same building. So they found mixed uses to be able to save buildings. And the thing is that we can't save them all. You have to find some purpose and something sustainable that will keep them going from year to year and year. And that's the hardest part about all this, is how do you save it? And that is the end of my presentation. But before I go, I just want to show you one thing. We've been working for some time on creating an Upper Peninsula Heritage Trail Network. It's a website about historic sites in the UP. And we now are very close to having it completed. We've been working on it for a few years now, and your historical society and several in Chippewa County helped us identify sites that would be featured in the trail. We have about a dozen historic sites in each county in the UP featured. These are the sites right now that we have featured from Chippewa County. That isn't to say that these will be the last ones that will be on here, but right now we're limiting it to about a dozen in each county. For various reasons I don't necessarily want to get into. There are some counties that don't even have a dozen historic sites in them, so we did want to have 5 in one county and 25 in another, for political reasons. So, but we've selected these so far in Chippewa County. Like I said, there will be others. And I want to thank the folks at the Historical Society. One day spent an entire day with me just looking at sites and finding sites, one of them being Camp Rako, west of here. This is all that's remaining of Camp Rako off of M28. It's actually not very hard to find. I took this photo in the wintertime. I trudged out there in the snow to find that this is all that's remaining. And there are some foundations. It was a CCC camp. And then later, after it was a CCC camp, was a Nazi prisoner of war camp. So an incredible history. And right off of I forget the road itself. But one of the things we do have is directions. So you can click on that and it'll tell you how to find it. In fact, in some cases we have the coordinates because it's not so simple as just take a left here. And we have Google Maps, so you can actually find it on a Google map. And it's in Rako, which, when you're in downtown Rako,
The village of Rako.
the village of Rako.
Oh, yeah, where is that?
Every once in a while when I'm driving here, and my wife's at home, I'll text her saying, I see the towers of Rako. Because 2 huge cell phone television towers in Rako. It's one of our little jokes, though. But anyway, it's actually right here. You see, here would be like downtown Rako, if you will. And you come to Ranger Road on your right, but if you take a left, you see this box here? That's where the camp was. It's right here off M28. You see the sign for Ranger Road. This box is where the actual camp was. So that's the neat thing about this website, is that we're trying to find really interesting sites around the UP. Some of them are obvious, like such as your museum or the Detour Light, but things like the Finn Hall on Drummond Island or on Sugar Island, which the Sugar Island Historical Society has done an amazing job in working on that building and getting it up and running. It's a historic site, and the Holy Angels Church. These are places that most people never go to and don't even know exist. And what we really want to do is get people, when they're coming to the UP, to use this site is go see these historic sites. And I think one of the most amazing was the Maxton Plains, Alvar and Drummond Island. This amazing landscape of rock, and it's just, there's quite nothing like it just about anywhere. It's amazing places. Unfortunately, some of the sites that we would like to feature, we can't feature for various legal reasons because they're private property, and we haven't got permission, and we had to get permission from a lot of these places to be able to feature them. And one not far from here that I think is one of my favorites the discoveries we find, the fiber and karst quarry down outside west of Trout Lake is just an amazing site. And yeah, it's just this wonderful old limestone quarry that is, it's like a moon landscape. It's huge. And it's not that hard to find. But I went there and I was the only person on the site the entire time I was there. It was really spooky, as a matter of fact.
There's also a cave on there.
Yeah, there's a cave. It's the largest cave in Michigan is there. Yeah. So they tell you don't go into the caves without a guide. I don't know if that's true, but we don't even have the directions, so it's kind of hard to find. We need to get our absolute directions, but it's located right here. You'll see the Fiber and Quarry Road, which is Trout Lake is right there. So if you take H40 before you get to Rexton, you'll see the Fiber and Quarry Road. It's in downtown Hendricks, if you've ever been to Hendricks. Well, that's the thing, is that this loop right here, this actually was a village. There was a small community in Fiber, which now it's just woods. It's all been swallowed up by the forest. But the quarry is still there, and it's a really fascinating place. And that's what I love about this site, is finding these sites that I didn't even know about. Like I said, we have the obvious ones and we have the non-obvious ones. Mackinac Island itself could have its own website, so we just have a link for Mackinac Island. We say go find the website. You can see all the stuff there. So anyway, that's just a preview of what this site will look like when we have it up and running, which I'm hoping is soon. We thought 6 months ago it would be up and running, and it hasn't happened yet. But our hope is that this will be a tool for people who are visiting the UP or people in the UP to find historic sites that they can view. And as you also see, there are no pop-ups, no advertisements, and that was deliberate. We wanted it to be a non-commercial website focused specifically on historic sites. There's no hotels, there's no restaurants unless it's a historic place. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of websites for convention and visitors bureaus and visitors type information, which we have links to. We wanted to focus on history, on the sites themselves. And some of them are just sites. There's no buildings, it's just a site where something happened. And that's why we created this site. So, and it was with the Western UP Heritage Trail Network. We already had a site, and we've just updated it and added to it. So I've been blabbing for almost an hour, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, and I'd love to open it up for any questions. Do you have any questions?
Dan,
Comments? Yeah.
you mentioned right at the very beginning a couple of men that worked with you up in Marquette, mentioned them by name, and I don't happen to know them, but I was curious, are they at the university or are they in the
No,
city?
Jack Dale ran Superior View. He's been here.
Oh, Jackie, okay, I know.
Yeah, and Jim Koski is the president of the Marquette Regional History Center on their board, and is a broadcaster in town. But he does walking tours of Marquette, and And so he and Jack got together to do a program. They've done several programs on lost buildings of Marquette.
All right, yeah.
We decided to kind of take it to, originally it was just going to be lost buildings. And it was so depressing that we thought, no, there's success stories too. And so that's why it became Lost and Found, you know. And we've had a great just response to people who came to it. It's now down. We just took it down, but we will be touring it. So hopefully it can come here someday to somewhere in Sault Ste. Marie. Yeah.
You know, one of the staggering things about old buildings, after reading thousands of pages of newspaper archives, is the fires. Everywhere had fires. Everybody had major downtown fires, at least one fire that pretty much wiped everything out. And I mean, that I would think has been the major variable in old buildings being lost, and along with the architectural stuff, and let's build new stuff, more practical stuff.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, fire is the biggest, I mean, even worse than urban renewal. But I think what's bad about urban renewal, though, I mean, the intentions were good, and sometimes it was necessary. But I think what was bad was it was a deliberate act, and at times a kind of the foresight was just really bad. And I've seen communities where they did a good job with urban renewal. I've seen communities where they just destroyed the community doing it. Hartford, Connecticut, where I lived for many years, is an example. Their downtown was this beautiful 19th century collection of buildings, just gorgeous. And in the 1970s, two major projects in downtown destroyed about 40% of the downtown. One was their civic center that they built, which is right in the middle of downtown, which they tore down about 3 blocks of 19th century, maybe even 18th century buildings. And then a whole neighborhood of 18th century kind of, I would say like row houses right along the river. They tore down to build freeway.
Yeah, freeway.
And a large plaza, office plaza. You know, there were reasons they did it, but when you look at the pictures of what downtown Hartford looked like, and now you look at it, it's just like, oh man. And it's actually one of the things that's killed Hartford was their downtown is no longer a destination. It's not a vibrant community because they destroyed most of it. And it's too bad because it was really, I mean, Mark Twain lived there for a reason. When he lived there, he moved to Hartford because it was such a vibrant community, literary community, arts community, and it is still to some extent today, but they did a number on Hartford, really did. And unfortunately, the mob had something to do with all of that. And that's the one thing I didn't realize. Growing up in the Midwest, we don't think about that stuff. And when I moved there were these construction projects that would go on forever, and like, why aren't they going to fix that? And people would say, well, the mob hasn't got all their money out of that yet. And I'm like, what are you talking about? All the construction companies were owned by a mob. And so, so projects go on for years and years, and projects get green-lighted because it's mob money. Boston, Hartford, New York. I would say all of them are, but a lot of them are controlled by the mob. And so it's really a different world. We just here we're so protected from that stuff, but there that's just part of life. Everybody there knows. Oh yeah, that's a mob. That restaurant, yeah, that's a mob. That's a mob restaurant. Don't go there. You know, or they go there like, oh yeah, there's mobsters. I guess that's their excitement. So, any other questions or comments? You raised your hand first.
Have you been to Duluth, Minnesota?
Oh yes, I love Duluth.
Fantastic job at Canal Park.
Canal Park's fantastic. Duluth has done an amazing job. That community was in real tough straits 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and I have a lot of family who live in Duluth now. A bunch of brothers and sisters live there because it's a city, it's a really livable, wonderful city now. They've got some problems in Duluth too. There's an East Duluth and a West Duluth, and that's part of the problem. The east side is the money side, and the west is the poor side. So that's still a problem there, but other than that, it's a really great city. They've done an amazing job. And it's become a destination for people. lot of people from Minneapolis, St. Paul go there on weekends to get away from Minneapolis, St. Paul. So and they're thinking of building a high-speed train between Duluth and the Twin Cities, which I don't know if that'll actually happen, but it would be huge if they did. It's really huge. Yes?
I was just gonna mention that Lake State still has a lot of its, well, it has 8 or 9 fort buildings.
Yeah.
Because it was, historic district was created, I think, in the 1980s. Professor Robert Money was instrumental.
Oh, yeah, about money, yeah.
in getting that taken care of. Otherwise, they would have been gone.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, too, about that is a lot of people think that if you put something in a national register, it's protected, and it's not. When you put something in a National Historic Register, you're regulated as to what you can do to the building, the renovations you can make, the changes you can make. But if you want to tear it down, you can do that. There's nothing stopping you from tearing the building down. When you create historic districts, though, when a community creates it, it's usually a sign that the community wants to preserve those and use them as for historic tourism. So it's a little bit different. It's less likely, but there's nothing stopping a private individual or even a community from tearing down a building on the National Historic Register. Other than the shame of doing it. You had a question,
Yes,
didn't
I
you?
did. I wondered, when K Hall was demolished,
Mhm.
were the building materials used any place else on campus, or was it strictly hauled away?
No. In fact, a lot of the brick from K Hall was stuck in a landfill west of town, and right now they're digging it up because the diocese wants to use the stone to build its new chapel for Bishop Erica. And so they're actually trying to buy the stone from Northern. Northern still technically owns it, but it's in a fill. We have saved some of the stone in other parts of campus, but none of it was used in building any other structures in town. Actually, the top of the Caroline Towers was reconstructed in the middle of campus, but very little of it. So, but other than that, no. Yeah.
I found out a few years ago that my grandfather came over from Finland, went to this logging camp, and it's called Half Michigan, which doesn't exist anymore, because there was some kind of fire in Trout Lake, and it went through, it's over there by Dick.
Wow.
It was a logging camp, and if you go in there, they still have the old bricks, they have broken glass.
Wow. Well, I'd love to track that down.
Yeah, I would
Sounds
like
an
to
interesting
see.
place to visit.
Yeah, a lot of history there.
Yeah, there is a lot of history in the woods in the Ute.
But when I looked it up in Red Yard, the lady said there was a fire. Well, when I went through the old newspapers and I couldn't find any type of fire that happened.
I don't know. I'll have to ask my wife about this. Sir, you had a question.
Out of the state of Michigan, Galena, Illinois is a fantastic destination for anybody that wants to see some
Oh, yeah.
really superb historical sites.
I've heard that. I've never been to Galena.
The whole city is just about retained, fortunately no fires. Another good place downstate is little town of Manistee.
Manistee.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Manistee is fantastic. Marshall is a fantastic place to visit. If you've never been to Marshall, you got to go there. They did an amazing job restoring a lot of their neoclassical or colonial revival homes and buildings in Marshall. And there's communities all over Michigan that are just fantastic. I was in Muskegon last year, and Muskegon has some fantastic structures. Most of the city has been kind of decimated, but there are pockets of just absolute fantastic homes and buildings in Muskegon. And I think you find that pretty much anywhere in Michigan. You find these communities that have just fantastic. I mean, Detroit still has incredible historic treasures. And it really breaks my heart when I think of what's happened with a lot of the strides. I can't even think about Tiger Stadium being torn down. It just makes me sick to my stomach. They didn't have to tear down Tiger Stadium. They didn't have to keep using it for the Pride Tigers, but they didn't have to tear it down. They could have saved it, and they should have. It was a major mistake by the city of Detroit to tear it down.
think, when Galena, Illinois was mentioned, and the same thing with Menominee, in both of those cases, during the urban renewal years, the first time I was in Galena was in the 60s, and, I mean, there was nothing, there was no economy there at all, so urban renewal didn't do anything to those buildings. There were no false fronts put on it, and the same thing happened in Menominee.
Yeah.
That the original building is still there, so now when they're restoring them, they have what was there originally.
Yeah, and that is the case. Some communities simply couldn't afford to tear down the buildings, and that's a good thing. A good example of that, Traverse City, the state hospital project, now the Commons project. It's the largest historic preservation project in the country. And what they're doing, they've done just an incredible job with that facility. It's absolutely beautiful. A building that a lot of people thought would never exist. They were going to tear it down. They've restored that, most of that building and all the exterior buildings now. But I mean, Traverse City already had a lot of great things, but it's already just even made the community much stronger by doing that.
They have a very nice self-guided walking tour in Calumet.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The building might be a pizza restaurant now, but it's still there.
Calumet's still a fun place. It's great. If you ever go to Calumet, you want to spend the night. I've stayed twice at the Michigan House, where the restaurant and bar is. Upstairs, there are 2 apartments they rent out like as a bed and breakfast. Well, bed, no breakfast. And they're old apartments for people who live there, and they're just like they were 70, 80 years ago, and they are so cool to stay in. I've stayed there twice. It's inexpensive too. It's like $80 a night, which is cheap. And so if you're ever going up there, you're going to spend the night, see if you can stay there. It's really worthwhile. It's a great old world experience.
How about Shooty's Bar?
Shooty's Bar, which is just, so once you go drinking at Shooty's Bar, you can crawl back to the Michigan House. My brothers love staying there at Michigan House because they can drink and then crawl up the stairs to their bed. They don't have to drive anywhere.
Plus, they have a leaded glass canopy over the whole length of the bar, over the bar, which is very significant.
Oh, it is. And all of the structures there in the bars, it's a great place. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.